Welcome, and thank you for watching. I'm Matthias. I'm a designer in the game industry, most recently as lead designer on Star Wars 1313 at LucasArts. You can follow me on Twitter, or you can reach me via email using the addresses you see on the slides here. This lecture is called Talking to the Player, How Cultural Currents Shape Game and Level Design, and it was originally presented at the Game Developers Conference in 2013 as part of the AAA Level Design Bootcamp. This is really just one long stream of consciousness. For the next 50 minutes, I want to take you on a journey, and I hope that the destination will mean as much to you as it did to me. So, let's get started. In early December of 1935, the Pittsburgh Press reported Milman Perry's death in a Los Angeles hotel room. Professor killed in weird shooting. Harvard man shot as he tries to untangle gun from clothes. Now, Milman Perry's death might indeed have been bizarre, but today he's remembered as the founder of the study of oral tradition and as a pivotal scholar of ancient Greek epic poetry, which is a field that he revolutionized, in large parts due to field work that Milman Perry did just before he died while he was in Yugoslavia. And more specifically rural, illiterate pockets of Yugoslavia, because this was an environment which closely resembled Perry's original interest, which was Greece at the dawn of Western civilization. Well, at least in that the written word did not yet exist in this part of the world. Now, as a fully literate culture, this environment is so fundamentally alien to us, we are so indoctrinated into the written word, that the implications of an alternative, a culture where nobody writes and nobody ever has written, is not something we ever really consider. So, we're going to need some perspective, and this perspective is where I want to start our journey today. In an oral culture, ideas, thoughts, and content are mediated via the spoken word only. Ideas are fleeting. After a thought has been expressed, it immediately disappears forever, and only a memory remains. Now, I want to tie everything that I'm talking about today into entertainment, because generally, computer games are viewed as that. So, imagine if you were to hear a story in this oral environment. Well, content is always tied to a performance. The only way to hear a story is through somebody else. Somebody has to talk to you. There's no master copy, so the story itself is fluid. It changes as repeat performances mutate the content. The overall theme stays the same, but the details change, and in the audience there's an expectation that every instance of a story is different. So everybody carries around his own personal version of the story. And people understand the topic aggregatively. A story is slowly pieced together, a little bit here, a little bit there, plucked from different sources. The flow of information is non-linear. Things are never in sequential order. Now also imagine what this environment does to the concept of authorship. Because interference with the content is considered normal. The only way to keep a cultural identity alive is through constant dialogue. Society has to keep reminding itself of what it collectively knows. So there is no concept of the individual work or authorship as we know it. Authorship is shared and communal. Now you might think that a fleeting oral environment like this one cannot produce large epic tales like the ones we're used to, and until Milman Perry, that was the established opinion. And yet it does. Milman Perry was studying Yugoslav bards who were singing thousands of lines of poetry without the benefit of any written notes. And he discovered that bards don't learn each tale verbatim. They remember them via formula, which is directly imprinted in the language of the songs themselves. Defining linguistic features, such as the meter, redundancies like epithets, serve as mnemonic aids and as construction rules for each line of the song. So this formula is almost mathematical in nature. Each singing performance expresses the same theme differently, using different formulas, and as a result, depending on the crowd, the situation, the singer's own mood, and his memory, these Yugoslav bards never tell the same tale twice. Perry demonstrated that all poets can indeed compose, remember, and sing thousands of lines of poetry without the benefit of writing. And they do this by taking a well-established topic and improvising on it anew in each performance. Perry then went back to his original interest and applied his findings to Homer, who was considered to be one of the earliest and most famous authors in human history. Or was he? Perry identified an abundance of parallels between the Iliad and the Odyssey and the songs that he had studied in Yugoslavia. Homer's work possesses the same formula that Yugoslav bards use to remember and tell their stories. And even though Perry got a lot of pushback at first, ultimately only one conclusion was possible and is universally accepted today. Homer's epic tales were not written as literature. They must have existed as improvised oral poetry first. The man who we know as Homer was a scribe who, for the first time in human history, used the written word to create a fixed and authoritative version of what used to be shared cultural knowledge by writing it down. Now, you might be asking at this point what this has to do with our modern day culture or let alone computer games. Well, Perry's work is so important not just because it illuminated a time when nobody was writing or the inevitable transition from orality to the literate culture that came afterwards. Perry created a foundation that generations of scholars have used to make us aware of something much more crucial. The way in which a culture mediates ideas and content fundamentally affects our views and expectations. It even influences the very way we think, which is then reflected in the popular entertainment of that age, including computer games. As the written word displaced orality, it caused wholesale changes to the human psyche. Eric Havelock called the transcription of Homer's tales something of a thunderclap in human history, which laid the basis for the destruction of the old way of life and the old modes of thought. He showed how the Greek mind shifted from experiential thinking, a society that organized experience in terms of events, I might call this gameplay, to a culture that organized experience in terms of ideas, increasingly embracing abstract and logical thinking, something I might call structure. Russian psychologist A.R. Luria showed that literacy creates a tendency to think categorically and draw conclusions. And there's one fact here which is even more important to us. Literacy fundamentally rewires our brain to accept sequential logic, which is something that doesn't really come natural to us, as anybody with a toddler will attest to. As Marshall McLuhan points out, the act of reading conditions us to accept sequence as rationale. Through reading, we get so used to following somebody's stream of consciousness that we trust in the inherent sequential logic of what is being said. We have to be able to trust that the author knows where he's going, otherwise we wouldn't be able to read fluently. And that's a convention that we're raised into these days from earliest childhood. And it's the first big change in how living in the print culture changes the way we perceive content. Knowledge is organized sequentially, which gives rise to this convention of sequence as rationale, which is a concept that doesn't really exist in an oral culture. In fact, you're going to see its analog change throughout this talk on the left side here. All cultures, by necessity, have to organize information into frameworks of knowledge in which each element must be able to continuously justify its relationship to the other elements of the framework. Now, you might have noticed me talking about print culture instead of literate culture just a little bit earlier, and I'll specifically start using this term going forward, because I want to account for the Gutenberg printing press, which, by making mass reproduction of content possible and putting us on the path towards mass literacy, affected all of the cultural changes that we're talking about here. Elizabeth Eisenstein identified the press as an agent of cultural change and analyzed in detail how it changed modern culture. But rather than trying to summarize her findings, I'll keep the discussion in the realm of entertainment. So let's consider now how we would learn a story in this new print culture environment, and let's compare it to the old oral culture. Well, there now is a master copy. Print creates this ability to lock down ideas and thoughts, so there is an authoritative and fixed version of the content, and this content reaches every audience member in exactly the same version. And content is not tied to performance anymore. Deferred consumption, far removed from its conception, is now normal. Now, as I already mentioned, rather than piecing together a story out of multiple performances, stories are now consumed linearly. Via big books or long movies, there's an expectation now that you can finish a story. And this is where the belief in the individual work by an original author begins. It's an author whose work is considered original and which ought to be mediated with as little change as possible because the author knows best and has implied authority on the subject. So you might say, okay, all this perspective is great, but games haven't exactly been accused of being too much like books. Well, at least not recently. Why is this important? Well, it's important because there is a medium that we do commonly get compared to, and that's the movies. And the foundation created by literacy extends far beyond the actual act of reading. Film also rests on it. In the Gutenberg galaxy, Marshall McLuhan extends his notion of sequence as rationale to film. A literate audience, accustomed to following printed imagery line by line without questioning the logic of linearity, will accept film sequence without protest. The logic of linearity lets the medium specificity of film. Creating what we call continuity cinema means creating an authored stream of consciousness which asserts logic with every cut. And to be able to follow the stream of consciousness, the audience needs to be aligned with the cultural values of the author. And we all share these conventions. It's the reason that all of our minds, instead of simply trying to group this collection of pictures based on content, contrast, etc., automatically turn these images into a sequence and try to figure out a story, starting at the top left and ending at the bottom right, going sequentially. Film works because as we watch, we shift into a frame of mind that doesn't just accept, it expects sequence as rationale. We enter a passive environment in which we willingly submit ourselves to somebody else's authored stream of consciousness with its inherent logic. And in that way, film is the ultimate expression of the acquired conventions and the mindset of the print culture. It is monolithic, it is linear, it is fixed and authoritative, and it broadcasts exactly the same message to everybody. But computer games are trickier than film. They're not just a continuation of that aesthetic. In fact, if you look at our chart here, the values of computer games are all over it, on both sides. And that's where this background is becoming relevant to us. Imagine that I want to make a first-person shooter game. I assemble my core creative team and we take the correct first step. We have a series of heated discussions to figure out what we're all about, what our core values are. Because these discussions are always heated because people are going to be very passionate about the kinds of issues that we have to figure out. How linear should our game and our levels be? How personal does the player story have to be? What's our role as authors in the game? Can the player interfere with the fundamental story structure? Maybe there are multiple endings. And is this game systemic, or does it have a lot of special case situations, like set pieces? Finally, how does the story come together? And how do we motivate the player? Do we rely on authored sequence, or does the player figure it out herself? Now, for each trajectory, I can come up with a poster child example of a game. Let's imagine that I'm making a game that is very systemic, so it has very different and often unpredictable outcomes for each area of play, which leads to very diverse player stories. Well, in this game, the player might collect information. There might be story logs, for example, which slowly create this mosaic of knowledge. This is probably a game that's okay with the player interfering with its structure. It abdicates a lot of authorship to the player, and it doesn't rely on the authored sequence to motivate the player. The player is given a general goal and then figures out the solution on her own. Well, if I'm making a first-person shooter, I just made Dishonored. Or maybe if I was making a role-playing game instead, I just made Skyrim. But there's an equally valid flip side we should look at, because there are many games that subscribe to the values of the print culture. These games embed a lot of pre-authored content that every player sees the same way, which means that all play experiences are roughly the same. Now, these games are very linear in the story and mission structure, so the player doesn't get to interfere with the higher structure of the game at all, which to us is kind of the traditional print culture authorship paradigm. And sequence as rationale is a part of these games, for example, in how player motivation is created or in deciding what happens next. Well, in this case, the first-person shooter I just made might be Modern Warfare, for example, or if I want to find a juxtaposition to Skyrim, I might just have made Final Fantasy. So I can easily map Dishonored to one culture and Modern Warfare to the other. Never mind how different these games are in their subject matter, that's not important. The aesthetics of these first-person shooters, as expressed on either side, are radically different. Subconsciously, whenever we're having a discussion about the core values of the game, we're debating to which aesthetics of which age games subscribe to. And this is where things get tricky, because all of this is a little bit confusing. We're surrounded by artifacts of the print culture, like books and movies, and chronologically, it makes sense that computer games would be an extension of that period. Obviously, they've influenced our medium in many, many ways. Yet the old way of thinking does still come natural to us, and many computer games seem to go back in time and embrace the aesthetics of orality. Except that this doesn't immediately make sense, because obviously there is no secret conspiracy in which ancient Greeks invented the computer and have generation after generation covertly passed down their knowledge to companies like Bethesda and, wait a second, Arcane Studios, maybe? No, that's probably not where the name comes from. So this is confusing, and it's at the root of many discussions that we're having in our daily developer lives. And luckily, it's not actually all this hard to explain this apparent disconnect if we clear up one common misconception. We don't actually live in the age of print culture anymore. We're transitioning to a new age brought on by a new agent of cultural change, the computer. And just as in earlier ages, the way in which our culture now mediates ideas and content, procedurally through the computer, fundamentally affects our views and expectations. Marshall McLuhan was the first to point out that the new ways of communication built on the platform of electricity are bringing us closer to the aesthetics of old oral cultures. Walter Ong called this new age secondary orality, describing it as essentially a more deliberate and self-conscious orality based permanently on the use of writing and print. In other words, we're talking to each other again, but instead of talking into the void, we are now talking via literacy. Now, the internet is the best example of what secondary orality represents. Facebook, Google, Wikipedia, YouTube, Reddit, Twitter, all of these are ways in which we now gather content and in which we communicate. We live in an age now that mediates all content procedurally in what amounts to performance. In today's life, there's always a layer of abstraction through the computer. Information isn't simply retrieved in its hard-coded state, it is constructed at runtime, for example, in HTML code or on your Twitter feed. But because secondary orality builds on top of the print culture, all of the abilities and achievements that we've gained, all of the information we've created remain. It's just that our literate mindset has been restructured to resemble that of an oral culture. We're accessing knowledge non-linearly, which creates much more personal stories. People are used to building personal frameworks of knowledge again. And procedure makes interference more normal again. Anybody who's reading Wikipedia can immediately edit it, for example. So shared authorship of some kind is increasingly expected and becoming the norm again. So a more accurate version of this cultural progression towards secondary orality might actually be this one, where both cultural ages contribute to the final result. As before, the cultural undercurrents of this age, this digital lifestyle that we're now following, are going to bleed into popular entertainment, especially because that entertainment, which is computer games, is based on the same agent that's causing the change in the first place. Secondary orality is procedural, and games are procedural, and it's my belief that, just like cinema is the perfect embodiment of print culture, computer games are the perfect embodiment of secondary orality. A medium that uses its procedural nature to structure the personal, first-hand experiential meaning of all cultures and the abstract concepts and big ideas established through the written word. And the result is a unique expression of what secondary orality represents. Computer games combine aesthetics of both ages and create something that is specific to our medium. Film and books cannot do what computer games do. Neither can orality. Computer games are the only entertainment that matches the cultural undercurrents of our time. So, talking to the player, how cultural currents shape game and level design, I hope I'm starting to give you a good idea of how that second part of the description is true. Let's get to the talking bit. Let's see if we can make some of this knowledge applicable, and if we can use it to talk about games in specific terms that matter to us in daily developer life. Because frankly, saying that this definition here describes a game and that this game is an expression of secondary orality sounds grand, but what does it really mean? And honestly, what it really means is difficult to describe because games cover such a huge range and can generate meaning in so many different ways. It's hard to figure out what to focus on. But if we go by this definition, that games use procedurality to sequence personal, experiential meaning and abstract big ideas, well, we have something to go on. Right? Every game has first-hand experiential meaning. We call this gameplay, and almost every game has some sort of message that it's trying to convey via pieces of embedded content. And at some point, these elements, with their different aesthetics from different cultural ages, will clash via the authored structure of the game. And that clash is something very specific that we can talk about. We can ask some specific questions that explore this inherent conflict, which then might help us understand games better as a whole. If gameplay and embedded content can coexist in the game, well, we might ask what the common denominator is, and which of course begs the question what the essence of gameplay and embedded meaning is in the first place. But once we figure out this common metaphor, we can then use it to talk about very specific issues that every level designer and narrative designer struggles with on a daily basis. For example, how we integrate gameplay and embedded meaning into the larger structure of the game so that everything feels natural and harmonious. And we might also ask what game design's authorship paradigm is in the first place and how it compares to the authoring of this embedded meaning that we're talking about here. In other words, we might ask how we as designers assert authorship even though we're not hard coding this meaning. So I think we can tackle the first three questions together because they go all hand in hand. We know that gameplay and embedded meaning are products of different ages, and just a few slides ago I used a common metaphor for both. When I framed cultural ages in terms of communication, orality is an age exclusively built on dialogue. Then the printing press comes along, and it locks us inside our heads. It creates an age characterized by monologue. But secondary orality comes around and restores us to an age in which we talk to each other again. I used the internet and social networks as examples earlier because they're easily understood in the context of secondary orality, but it's important to point out that dialogue is at the very essence of not the computer itself, but our interaction with the computer. If you think about it, every input into the computer is a question, and each response from the computer is an improvised answer generated at runtime. So every interaction with the computer can be framed as a dialogue with the machine based on the procedures encoded in the program. And this applies to computer games as well. And I think intuitively we know that gameplay is a procedural dialogue between the player and the game. We often frame the player's interaction with the game in terms of player verbs which represent the gameplay abilities afforded to the player. If you think about it, every game unfolds as a series of statements, questions, and replies. And you might think now that, well, this dialogue analogy is particularly obvious in Zork because it uses a text parser, so we're literally talking to the game, but the analogy still holds up as we limit the input range from, I guess, all the words in the English dictionary to a modern console controller with fewer, sometimes context-sensitive inputs. A game, like Dishonored, talks to the player because this is what's going on behind the scenes. Etc. pp. Now, once we frame gameplay as a procedural dialogue, we can frame embedded content as a monologue. And a monologue section is pretty much every part of the game that subscribes to the aesthetics of print culture and that it represents a pre-authored authoritative stream of consciousness. Example might be cutscenes, because the game shifts from an active dialogue with the player to a passive environment where it's telling the player something. Literally a monologue. It might be a QuickTime event where the game shifts from its regular systemic play space, this procedural dialogue, into a prescriptive designer-authored sequence of events. It's not a true monologue, of course, but it feels like one because the conversation becomes very lopsided. It can only be advanced through special case player verbs. Finally, a disproportionate overload of context-sensitive buttons, for example the interact button, might read as a monologue because it creates an asymmetry between the player's regular dialogue with the game and this very specific interaction. The regular press Y to open door turns into press Y to start Mars rover, enter descent landing, and engage sky crane. Right? The game is monopolizing the conversation in this case based on a single player verb. So I think this answers the first three questions, because if we frame gameplay as a procedural dialogue and embedded meaning as a monologue, we can look at the overall structure of the game as a conversation between the computer and the player. And what I really like about this metaphor is that I can easily come up with simple, common sense rules that should govern this conversation, which will provide answers to the next question on our list. But you know what? Before we get into this question, we should make one quick detour. We should acknowledge that there are many different ways of structuring experience in a game. In fact, we touched on this a little bit earlier, in the context of cultural values and which aesthetics of which age our game should subscribe to. I might embrace the values of print culture because I believe in strongly structured linear stories. After all, there must be a reason we have perfected this art over the last 150 years. So in trying to carry this tradition forward, my game will try to integrate gameplay and embedded meaning elegantly into one, probably linear, pre-authored sequence. But I might also rediscover the old age of orality and embrace the values of aggregation and personal meaning, so my game will not be a linear sequence, and it will try to give the player a lot of agency over how the individual pieces of embedded meaning are extracted from the game by the player. There is no clear right answer here. I can channel different industry views and make a case for both extremes. I can also point out the problems that both sides have when they're taken to extremes. All games are accused of not having enough impact in their presentation or story. Everything is so procedural that everything feels kind of flat and no strong themes emerge. But super linear story games are often accused of not giving the player enough control. People ask, why is this a game in the first place? Now, honestly, both of these are extremes, and chances are that you can find yourself somewhere in the middle. Now, for the rest of this talk, I want to focus on a simple setup, a simple linear structure, because I believe that looking into alternatives, like open world, non-linear, or even procedural structures, is a rabbit hole that we do not want to go into right now, while we're still in the middle of figuring out all of the other questions that we asked earlier. So we'll look at something like this. If this chart represents a mission in the game, what we're really worried about are these little connector lines right here. Because this is where we transition between the procedural dialogue and the monologue of the game. Okay, so this was a quick detour. Let's get back to the issue at hand. As I've already said, what I really like about the metaphor of gameplay as a conversation is that I can easily come up with simple common sense rules that should govern this conversation. And honestly, to me there's just one rule when I'm talking to somebody. Well, maybe two. For one, I want this other person to be actually interested in me. I don't want it to be somebody who is so self-absorbed and so narcissistic that he likes to hear himself talk. But there's another even more important rule. I don't want this other person to be rude. I don't want him to be disrespectful. Imagine this. You're walking alongside somebody, engaged in a conversation, and this other person is interesting, making great points. You're asking some questions, you're making some great points yourself, and just as you're having this really interesting, deep exchange, the other guy abruptly grabs you by the arm, starts pulling and shoving you around, and he's just ignoring everything you say from now on, and he keeps talking over you. Now, we wouldn't put up with this in real life. Why would we let games do it? Pieces of monologue, like cutscenes, should never trigger unexpectedly. If the game takes away control from the player, effectively monopolizing the conversation, the player needs to be able to anticipate that. So the transition should happen on player input, or because the player successfully completes a player goal. For example, you might be climbing into a window, and that was clearly established as a midterm goal. Or you might be jumping down a balcony when it's clear that our goal was to get into that courtyard in the first place. So imagine the same situation again, where you're walking alongside this person, but this time your conversation partner has actually learned some manners. He waits until you're done talking, or you actually invite him to speak before he starts his monologue. And you're ready, you're listening. After all, you engaged in this conversation in the first place because you expected this guy to have interesting things to say. So that's not the problem here, right? It's just that once he starts talking, he starts blabbing about something that's completely unrelated to everything that you were just talking about. You were having an interesting discussion about the finer points of duck hunting, for all I care, and all of a sudden he starts telling you about the dangers of falling in love with the wrong woman or something like that. Once again, that's rude, and once again, we wouldn't put up with this in real life. Monologue sections in a game should be the logical extension of the conversation that you were having with the game. They need to make a point that's very related to what you and the game have been talking about. Now, these are just a couple of examples. I'm sure you can extend this metaphor easily and can come up with a few new ones. In fact, there's some of them right here. Now, the rules behind all of this are simple. Don't be rude and keep transitions predictable. And as long as you do that, as long as the player either has the ability to opt in when the game starts talking, or as long as the player can easily predict the shift, you have a good recipe for integrating static content with gameplay regardless of which game you're making. Your game might actually be quite systemic, but every so often there might be story cutscenes, and when they occur, you should keep these rules in mind. Now, additionally, I think we should look at what happens if we try to push this integration of elements as far as possible, to the point where we're actually trying to emulate the aesthetics of film. I guess what we really need to explore here is what it means to make a cinematic action adventure, like Uncharted. And I think that starts with the question, what is a cinematic action adventure? Because once we get past the ideas like, well, it means emulating film camera lenses, it means movie framing, it means creating a story-driven experience, etc., I think what it really means is going all the way in on the values of the print culture side of the spectrum, which includes embracing the concept of sequence as rationale to structure the game, to drive the story, and to motivate player goals. If film is an authored stream of consciousness that reasserts its inherent, unquestioned logic with every cut, a cinematic action adventure tries to do the same. The designer is creating an authored stream of consciousness, and he expects the player to get into the mindset of wanting to reconstruct that stream. So the game still unfolds as a procedural dialogue, but the aesthetics that this game is emulating are actually those of a different monologue. And that means creating an environment in which player and designer are always on the same page. There can't be any doubt about what will have happened in any gameplay situation. That's the only way to keep this flow, this stream of consciousness, alive and aligned, because once they diverge, they're really hard to realign again. Now, don't get me wrong, this doesn't mean shallow gameplay without player choice. It just means that each gameplay section needs to lead to one predetermined outcome. The what happened needs to be obvious ahead of time and never in doubt. Everybody will have died might be a good outcome, for example. It can't be, well, I could sneak around in the situation or do non-lethal takedowns or I could fight. It needs to be one predetermined outcome. And then, exactly how what happened, that can be left up to the player. This can be a personal player story inside the predetermined print culture framework. Now keep in mind that I did not work on Uncharted, and I encourage you to watch the brilliant GDC lectures that Naughty Dog developers have given on this topic, but I have been thinking about this genre quite a bit, and I know that pulling off sequence as rationale in an active game environment is incredibly difficult. If you're trying to emulate film aesthetics, I'd just like to point out a couple of general caveats that you have to be aware of, because movies can get away with sequence as rationale much more easily than games. Movies are able to localize the rationale to the vicinity of surrounding cuts. They can create bubbles of logic throughout the entire game. This is the reason, for example, that Faramir can use a single arrow to drive away a fell beast in one scene from Lord of the Rings, while just a little bit later a whole army of Gondorian soldiers can get decimated by 3 fell beasts, and the Gondorians have no means of defense. I mean, really? After that earlier scene, you would think that those soldiers would have 3 freaking arrows to spare, but they don't, and movies get away with these kind of inconsistencies all the time. If you try it yourself, you'll be surprised by how often you don't notice things in movies that would stand out like a sore thumb in the game. And that's because of the mindset that we're in when we're watching a movie. In a game, the player needs to be able to rely on a consistent system space with one internally consistent logic. And that's where conventions from print culture don't automatically carry over. So, there are some things that we should not do in my mind, even in a cinematic action adventure. For example, we should not lock out player verbs without the player knowing about it. Whenever you assert sequence as rationale in your game, for example, by restricting player abilities in one section of the game, because it might add drama or it might put an interesting twist on the possibility space, well, that change needs to clearly register. It needs to be shown to the player. It needs to be consistent with the behavior during gameplay sections, and it needs to be motivated by perceptible external forces. Because I'm sure you can imagine how disrespectful the alternative would be if we use our dialogue metaphor. Imagine that somebody that you've been talking to the entire time all of a sudden starts acting like he doesn't understand verbs anymore that you've been using in this conversation all along. Honestly, you just think this guy's a dick who's intentionally ignoring what you're trying to say. So artificially restricting the procedural dialogue of the game, especially without explanation, rubs players the wrong way. You might remember the discontent over the boss fights in Deus Ex Human Revolution, which was a great game. I finished it, I loved it, but there were these 3 sections in the game that forced the player to play in a very specific way, which was fight to the death. Even though the rest of the game offers a lot of additional expressiveness, like stealth and non-lethal play. Now, part of this uproar over the boss fights was simply over the disproportionately high difficulty level of these sections, but there was something more fundamental going on as well. Players didn't understand or accept the rationale behind these restrictions. It was never explained why the procedural dialogue with the game was curbed in these boss fight sections, and it wasn't obvious that many topics, like trying to do a melee takedown on a boss, for example, were suddenly considered off topic until the player actually tried them. So even though the boss fights were gameplay, seen in the context of the rest of the game, these sections felt like a forced monologue. And this is something to keep in mind in general. The rules of the print culture, like sequence as rationale, don't automatically apply to our medium. And this can be difficult to remember because print surrounds us and it can be remarkably imperialistic. It locks us in a particular mindset. Literacy has a grip on the way we think because it reinforces its convention of unquestioned sequence as rationale every day. So it's very easy to get caught up in this mindset. But in games, often your sequence cannot be authoritative. In fact, it's very likely that your sequence is not even obvious to the player, unless you restrict it, and you make this part of the game a monologue, or a quasi-monologue. So don't get caught up in the dogma of your own sequence. There are always many different paths through the levels and through your game, both physically and conceptually. And this is something that you constantly have to keep reminding yourself of. So this was quite a download. But hopefully it sheds some light into the different meaning generating devices of games and how we make them happily coexist under one roof. If we frame both gameplay and embedded content as a conversation, we're using the same metaphor for something that has quite different aesthetics. And now we can talk about how we gracefully transition in and out of them and when we shouldn't. I feel our industry is still struggling with this. There are many examples in all of our games where transitions feel abrupt, unexpected, or wrong. And as a result, the player feels jerked around. And he doesn't have a great feeling of motivation and intentionality. He just follows the authored sequence of the game because it's there, but for some nagging reason, the inherent logic of following this sequence just doesn't hit home. It doesn't work as it would in a movie. Well, I think we now know why, and we can fix this. If we keep remembering that we live in a new age of dialogue, if we keep thinking about games as a conversation with the player, and if we understand why some of the old rules don't apply. Now this brings me to the last point on our list. So far, we've looked at integrating embedded meaning and gameplay, and this embedded meaning that we've been talking about follows a familiar, hard-coded authorship paradigm of the print culture, something that I believe we all inherently understand. But we should understand how it compares to authorship in gameplay sections. We should understand how we, as designers, talk to the player through our work. Because if you remember, and you take a quick step back, we said earlier that through the computer, secondary orality creates a new age of dialogue, and that this dialogue is fundamentally anchored in our interaction with the computer because each interaction with the computer can be framed as a procedural dialogue with the machine. And this is still all true. It's just that we were skimming on it a little bit because there's actually more going on here, a duality that we haven't explicitly talked about yet. Every interaction isn't just a conversation with the machine. It's also a dialogue with another person. Somebody at some point created the procedures which govern our interaction with the computer, and that's actually authorship. But it's a different authorship paradigm from what the print culture is used to because there is a level of interaction now. This author didn't just hard-code what the computer was actually going to say, he created guidelines. He created the model for the procedural dialogue. So when you're playing Dishonored, you're not just talking to the game, you're actually engaged in a deferred dialogue with the creators of the game as well. And when they want to, they actually express their own opinion on what you do and how you are playing the game. But they're doing it indirectly. The way that the computer mediates a designer's opinion has interesting parallels to what an oral bard does. The designer creates chunks of content, and the designer establishes formula, procedure, that encodes how this content behaves and relates to other elements of the game, and then the computer improvises this encoded opinion at runtime. And to give you an example of how both content and procedures are important parts of this indirect authorship paradigm, let's just create a small hypothetical game here. In this game, I have to destroy a bunch of square obstacles, but this doesn't get me any point. I just have to destroy these square obstacles so I can get to the actual red targets in the back, because destroying those does get me points. So the content that we're creating here are simple shapes, and the procedures that I have established determine how the game awards points to the player and how many points the player gets. So this is an act of authorship, and we generally just call this game design, although we rarely think of it as an expression of an opinion. So let's imagine the exact same gameplay scenario, but let's make a couple of small changes. Let's set this game at an airport, and let's replace the squares with civilians and the cylinders with security officers, and invite the player to interact again. It's exactly the same gameplay as before, but the emergent meaning of playing this game is now very, very different. The way we authored the content, what the scoring and non-scoring units look like, changes context and meaning, and it asserts an opinion. And how the procedures of the game govern the player's interaction with these elements, for example, the procedures might trigger a game over condition or not, also expresses the designer's opinion. So this is indirect authorship, but with a potential for expressing a clear opinion. We might say that computer games use formula, procedure, which is mathematical in nature, to express the same theme in different ways, depending on the player, her situation, and her mood, creating epic tales equivalent to thousands of lines of poetry, but which are never told the same way twice. And we might say that based on the procedure, which is encoded ahead of time by the designer, games are able to take a well-established topic and improvise on it anew in each performance, creating an experience that is never quite the same. Now, this comparison between what gameplay is and what an ancient oral bard does is actually quite poignant, as long as you remember one thing. The computer might be the bard, but it is you who creates this bard. You create the pieces of content, and you create the formula to improvise epic stories. You're using the computer as a tool, the mediator, to deliver that content in a deferred way. And that's one thing that all games have in common: the capacity for the personal player story improvised at runtime. At the lowest level, the authorship paradigm for all games is squarely in the age of orality. All games have gameplay. All games can use this gameplay to model aspirational fantasies, to reinforce player identity, and to create a customized experience that no other medium can provide. Gameplay is a unique representation of secondary orality, and computer games are the only procedural entertainment in an increasingly procedural world. But beyond gameplay, everything is up for debate. There are many ways in which an experience can be structured. We can apply the procedural nature of the computer to the story structure of the game as well, and people might argue that this non-linearity and aggregation aligns closely with the aesthetics of this new age. But honestly, it's a personal opinion. We're just at the beginning of this age, and I could argue just as strongly that strongly structured games are able to focus the experience better and keep the player engaged more, while allowing for the personal player story on top of that. And it's certainly not like print itself, and by print I don't mean a newspaper, I mean chunks of information that you might find on a web page, is going away. Let's not marginalize the role of print in secondary orality. The invention of writing got us where we are today in the first place. Writing enables the recording of history. It creates a mind that can think in abstract terms, and when one person is able to assert something, and that assertion can be remembered, tested, verified, disproven, and improved across time and space by multiple people, we get the scientific principle, which eventually gets us to the point where I can now use Google Books to find the exact article on Milman Parry's bizarre death over 75 years ago. Milman Parry, whose research only survived in the first place because he was able to write down his findings so that his son Adam Parry could publish his notes after the fact. Sequence as rationale is not going away. It's useful. And neither are the old authorship parodies going away, because they're useful as well. The fact that you've been watching my long stream of consciousness just now, and hopefully enjoyed it, is proof of that. The question for games is where to balance between embedded and emergent meaning, and how much of the computer's medium specificity to apply to the overall structure of the game. And as I said, that's really an impossible question to answer. But maybe history can help us, remembering one thing. There will have to be some sort of equilibrium here. There was a time when people found it inconceivable that epic poetry, like the Odyssey, could have been created through improvisation. Milman Parry came along and changed our fundamental assumptions, showing us that content plus formula could indeed create coherent stories which have meanings. But then there was a course direction that veered too far the opposite way, because for a while scholars believed that everything in the Odyssey was created via formula, up to 90%, which, as it turns out, makes everything formula, even the accidents, and nothing premeditated. Now these days, the established opinion is that every book of Homer's epics does indeed have deep roots in oral poetry, and that's how it was performed for a long time. But at some point, towards the end, writing must have been used to do more than just transcribe the epic. It must have been used to structure the individual parts of the Odyssey into a complete story arc as we know it today. And there is indeed a qualitative difference between the tales that Milman Parry heard in purely oral Yugoslavia and the epic stories of Homer, which have survived almost 3,000 years. These days, the balance between improvisation and memorized content in the Odyssey is thought to be somewhere around 50-50, where large parts of the tales were indeed performed through formula, but there are also chunks of content that must have become so refined over the years that the bard could fully memorize them and interject them in places where he needed some time to think up the next part of the improvisation, kind of history's earliest streaming corridors. But I digress. That ratio of 50-50 actually sounds pretty good to me, because it expresses the combinatorial nature of this age and how we now find meaning. And my general advice would be to use the tools of print culture and create poignant story structures, experiences that connect with people easily, that wow them. I think it's okay if 50% of the meaning is embedded in the game. But we should then remember that the other 50% should be emergent meaning and create deep personal gameplay that feels like it's part of the overall conversation. Because honestly, if you feel that only set pieces and QuickTime events can create memorable moments in your game, if that's your only attractor, you need to take a step back and you need to readjust your formula. Your gameplay isn't creating a memorable enough experience, and you're relying on artifacts of the print culture to make your game entertaining. And that's wrong. Let me just say it this way without speculating on what the future of gaming might really look like, but let me just point out one thing. Sony have announced the PlayStation 4, which, beyond some very impressive hardware specs, also has a share button right on the controller. Now, cutscenes of the future are going to be awesome. Believe me, I've seen some really cool stuff, but even I have been telling my teams that after one person has clicked on the share button, nobody will share your cutscenes and QuickTime events anymore. People will want to share their personal player stories, stories which are improvised by the game via formula in ways that are impossible to do in any other media. And that's where this new authorship paradigm is so powerful, because all of those shared, personal, and unique moments will have happened in your game, enabled by the procedural dialogue that you created. So let's make sure that players will have something to share, because that's going to give us and the rest of the world something to talk about. And really, that's what this age is all about. Thank you very much for watching. So, we're not quite done yet, because I think now it's all of our turn to further the dialogue. Please share this video, discuss it right here in the comments, on Twitter, on Facebook, wherever you would like. And please be aware of the fact that there are several topics that I barely scratched the surface of. For example, the capacity of games to act as pure platforms for player expression, something that is so far to the left end of the spectrum that it contains no elements of print culture aesthetics. In other words, a game that creates a giant sandbox in which procedural dialogue can take place. Multiplayer games actually fall into the same general area because they create a space in which players enter into a discussion using the procedural dialogue of the game. And MMORPGs combine all of that with increased social interaction. Finally, of course, there are actual social games, in which this crossover between our digital lifestyle and the medium of games is even more apparent. Now, I think all of these are topics that should be explored in more details. And I might get to them in good time, but hopefully we all start talking about this now. If you have some good thoughts, please let all of us know. Thanks again.